Hello and welcome back. In the last lecture, we saw how we can use an inbuilt skill and attach it to our indexer to modify our data from source before indexing it. In this one, we are going to build a custom skill which will be a web API. We are going to use Azure function to build our skill. And this time when we get the data from our Cosmos DB data source, we are going to process each row by sending a post call to this API or custom skill that we are going to build, and then get back the modified data and then index it. So as an example, we are going to add a new field called full address at the root level of our index, and we are going to send all the address data under fields to this new custom skill and get back a full address string which will be built out of street address and civic number. So we will just concatenate it in our custom skill and get back a new full address field from the API, which we will map back to our index in our output mapping. Now the custom web API skill that we are going to create, or the API, will need the data to be in a particular structure as input. So all the fields will go under a values top level array, and then each row will have a record ID mapped to it, and then each item will have the data field which will contain our fields that we are going to send. Now this mapping of values and record ID is done by Azure. You don't have to do anything. You just have to map the document/fields attribute as the input in our skill set. And web API skill will send the output back with the record ID mapped to each output along with the new output full address field, and this will all be under a values array. So let's go ahead and start building our first web API skill, which will be Azure function. Now to create our custom web API skill, I'm going to use the same my function app project that we created earlier in our previous section. So let's go back to our CLI. Now we are going to create a new function called custom skill API with template as HTTP trigger, and auth level is function. So this will create a auth token at the function level. We are going to need that token to be entered in our custom. We'll need that token to be entered in our skill set so that the skill set is able to access our function or authenticate to our function. So let's go ahead and create this new API. So we have a new custom skill API function created under our project. I'm going to change or just remove the get method because we just need the post method, and also I'm going to add a route. Don't want it to be default route, so let's just add the route. We just call it custom skill API. So this will be our path. That's it. Everything else remains the same. We are going to send HTTP output. Let's save it. Now I'm going to remove all these default coding. So we are going to get context and request as input parameters. Now let's take out the body that we are going to get in post call. I will also, so you can use context to log your data. Let's just log our payload just in case if we need to debug it later on. Now we are going to get the input from our skill set in the format we saw earlier. So we will get a values array as the top level attribute, and this array will contain each row as an object with record ID generated by Azure, and our fields or whatever the input we are going to send from the skill set those attributes will be under data. So here we are going to run a for loop to pick each row. So we are going to get values top level array under payload. So this value should have a record ID and data. So next we want to take out fields from value.data, right? We just destructuring it, taking out the fields. Now we will want to create an output array that we are going to send back with all the new fields generated. So this will be simple. We are going to just push items in this array, and these items will have the same record ID mapped back to our output. Now we can pick the record ID from our value incoming data. So output should have the same record ID for each row mapped back, so that your skill set can map the output to the initial input and then index it. And also we're going to send back new field. Okay, so we're going to name it full address, and this will be a string. So I just want to concatenate these three fields, standard street, civic number, and geolocal area, to create the full address under one string. So let's go ahead. So I'll need fields, civic number, space fields dot standard street, and then geolocal area. So that is our new output that we want to map in our index. Now I just want to send back the response. So we can send the response back from the API using context.response. Now response, if you remember, is the output name, output binding name. So you have to use the same binding name here. And then we need to add content type as application JSON, otherwise your skill set is gonna throw an error. It expects, so our skill set expects the output in JSON format, and then you can map the body, and the output is in similar format as input. So we need the top level values array. So I'm mapping my output with all the output records inside it to values, and then status is 200. That's it. Let's save our API and deploy it. And I'm just going to publish my function once again. So a function is deployed and it's accessible at this route, API/custom skill API. And if I go back to my function app, I can see my new function is deployed here, and I can access this function with app keys. So these are the keys generated. I can just use the default key. You can see the value here, copy it, and then use it as code while accessing your function. Now let's see how you can test your API. So I'm going to copy this URL here, and I'm going to create a new Postman request. It's a post call. Let's copy the URL, and inside the body we know that we need to send a JSON object, and this will have values as top level array, and then and then we must have a record ID. Now I'm just creating a random record ID here. This will be created by Azure for you, and then the data. And we know that we are going to send fields inside the data from our skill. So I'm going to just copy a sample fields here and paste it here. So this is our input. Now we also need to authorize access to a function. For that, you can go to your function app, then to your function key. You can also use function level keys. So under functions, you can go to custom skill API, to function keys, and just copy the key from here. Now to access your function, you can just pass it as query string code is equal to the key. Execute it, and there you go. So our function has returned the output full address with civic address, street name, and local area in one string. So when our skill set will make the same calls for each row in our data set to this API, we are going to get the full address back for each row mapped to the record ID, which is nothing but the row ID. In the next lecture, we will create a new field in our index and also create a new skill to map our new web API skills. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.